Hello, this is Jason. We are reading Who is Richard Branson? Chapter 1 to Chapter 3. I hope you like it. Who is Richard Branson? During the 1950s, the Branson family took a vacation to the beach in Devon, England. On the trip, 5-year-old Ricky's Aunt Joyce made a bet with him. She would pay him if he could learn to swim before the end of their vacation. Ricky spent the whole vacation trying to teach himself how to swim. Most of the time, he kept one foot on the sandy sea bottom and hopped along in the water. Waves would roll over him as he fought to keep the cold water out of his mouth. By the last day of the vacation, Ricky had not learned how to swim. Aunt Joyce told him he could try again next year, but Ricky wasn't ready to give up. He wanted to win the bet. Ricky made one last try to learn how to swim. His family gathered around to watch. Ricky saw his mother smile, as if she was thinking, "You can do it." He took a deep breath, went into the water, and then moved his arms and legs as best he could. He was swimming, going around in a circle. He heard his family cheering. When Ricky came ashore, Aunt Joyce handed him the money for winning the bet. Ricky later said that even though it was only about $2, it seemed like a fortune. As Ricky Branson grew up, he built a real fortune. He started many companies. Some of his businesses failed, but several became very successful. The world came to know him as the billionaire Richard Branson. And just as when he was a boy, he took plenty of risks. He learned to sail boats and to fly hot air balloons. He even bought a rocket that could take him into space. Richard lived by his thoughts. If you've got a great idea, you just need to give it a try. And if you fall flat on your face, pick yourself up and try again. Chapter 1. Early Challenges. On July 18, 1950, Richard Branson was born in London, England. Times were tough for his parents, Eve and Ted Branson. Ted was struggling to start his career as a lawyer, and the couple had little money. Eve helped out by making furniture, cushions, and selling them in local shops. The family had just bought a small cottage in the countryside of Surrey. His parents called their newborn son Ricky, though later everyone came to call him Richard. The Bransons didn't have a car. Ted drove the family's motorcycle, while Eve sat behind him. She held on tight to Ricky's baby carriage, which bounced along behind the bike. Baby Ricky seemed to enjoy the adventure, watching the scenery passing by. Over the next few years, Eve Branson expanded her little business of selling cushions. She began to make wooden boxes and wash baskets that she sold at Harrods, a large London department store. Ricky watched her work in a shed behind the family cottage. Eve was always trying to build her business. Still, it wasn't all work and no play for the Bransons. Eve and Ted enjoyed spending time with Ricky and the two sisters who followed him, Lindy and Vanessa. They were always a close family. As the Bransons earned more money, they were able to afford a van. The family would head off with the children sprawled out on a mattress in the back of the van. The Bransons talked about many things, from Ted's legal cases to current events in the news. Ricky's parents wanted him and his sisters to think for themselves. They encouraged their children to freely express their own opinions. Eve Branson also wanted her children to be comfortable in front of people. So when the Bransons had company, Ricky had to sing for the guest. He was sometimes shy around strangers, and he didn't like performing. Little by little, though, he got used to it, and he learned that he enjoyed entertaining people. Ricky was a playful, energetic boy. He loved to climb trees and ride his bike. He also worked in the family garden and helped his mother around the house. Ricky was great at sports. He ran races and played soccer and rugby. School, though, was a challenge. In the classroom, he struggled to read the blackboard until he got glasses at around age 10. He also had a condition called dyslexia that made it difficult for him to learn. With dyslexia, a person may not see numbers and letters in the correct order. They often have trouble reading, switching one letter for another. They might write lawn mower instead of lawn mower. As Ricky left home to go to Scatifius, a boarding school in Surrey. Ted Branson had gone to boarding schools too, as did most British boys whose family could afford it. They helped boys learn how to live away from their families and become independent. Because of his dyslexia, Ricky struggled with schoolwork. Scataffle allowed teachers to spank students with a cane if they made mistakes. Ricky was punished this way about once a week for simple mistakes, such as giving the wrong date on a historic event. The beatings didn't help Ricky improve in school. His grades remained poor, and his parents were afraid he would not be able to get into a good high school. After about 3 years, the Bransons sent Ricky to a new school, Cliffview School. Cliffview School was a special school for students who struggled to learn. Students studied constantly. For Ricky, that meant going a whole year without playing sports. But at his new school, Ricky worked hard and his grades improved. In September 1964, Ricky entered Stowe, a boarding school in Buckinghamshire. At Stowe, younger students like 14-year-old Ricky had to act as servants for the older boys. They had to run errands for them or do their chores. Stowe also forced all the boys to watch the school's sporting events. Ricky would have preferred to have the time for himself. He disliked most of the rules, and school was still a challenge for him. But Ricky developed a new interest at Stowe. He had seen his mother earn money by working from home. He wanted to start his own business too. He and his friend Nick Plow decided to grow and sell Christmas trees. The Bransons had just bought a new bigger home in Surrey with plenty of land. The two teens had lots of space for their new business. Within a year, Ricky figured the trees would be big enough to sell at Christmas time. The idea might have worked if rabbits hadn't eaten all the young trees. Despite the failure, Ricky had learned something about himself. When he tried to do math in school, his dyslexia made it very difficult to come up with the right answer. But in planning with his Christmas tree business, he also had to do math. He needed to figure out the total cost of the trees and how many he would need to sell to make profit. Suddenly, the numbers made more sense. He actually enjoyed doing the math. At Stowe, Ricky also began to improve his writing. He even won a writing contest. Ricky became so confident with his writings that he and his friend Johnny Holland Gems decided to start a magazine. Ricky's parents had raised him to be independent and think for himself. He later said, "I have always thought the rules were there to be broken." So in that magazine, he and Johnny wanted to write all about of the Stowe rules they thought was so unfair. But they didn't want to publish it just for Stowe students. They wanted other teenagers to read it. So they called the magazine Student. Barely 15, Ricky called his parents and said he wanted to leave school and publish his magazine. Eve and Ted Branson made a deal with Ricky. He could drop out of school, but first he had to pass at least one class. Ricky dropped all his other classes to focus on only one subject, ancient history. Then he spent hours creating the first issue of Student. He wrote letters of famous people seeking interviews. He called companies asking them to buy advertisements. He was so young, he never stopped to think how crazy it might be to start a magazine. But Ricky, in 1967, had passed his ancient history class. His parents kept their part of the agreement and let Ricky leave Stowe. He and Johnny planned to move to London and focus all their attention on Student magazine. As Ricky said goodbye to the man who ran the school, the headmaster's parting words to him were, "I predict that you will either go in prison or become a millionaire." He knew that Richard Branson was determined to succeed, but he wasn't sure where Richard's love of breaking the rule would lead him. Chapter 2. First Business. Just 17, Richard Branson left the countryside and moved to one of the most exciting cities in the world. Great Britain had struggled to rebuild after the destruction it suffered during World War II. But now, many people had better jobs and the economy was improving. The capital was nicknamed Swinging London in 1967. The city had become a center of fashion, music, and art. Much of the new music was popular with teens around Richard's age. He wanted to write about music and other things the younger people of London were interested in. But starting Student wasn't easy. Richard and Johnny Gems moved into the basement of the Gems' home. They had no money and they slept on mattresses tossed on the basement's floor. Eve Branson sometimes came down to Surrey to bring them food. They set up their office in a dusty crypt, an underground vault sometimes used as a tomb, under a church. A local minister had loaned them the space for free. Richard and Johnny worked so hard they didn't even seem to notice the coffins all around them. Richard put a slab of rock on top of two of the coffins and used it as a desk. Johnny knew which musicians were popular and what world events teenagers were talking about. He came up with most of the ideas for the magazine's articles. Meanwhile, Richard managed the business side of Student. He kept looking for the companies to buy ads and contacted entertainers and government leaders for interviews. Richard was charming and had a way of convincing people to work with him. He was also stubborn. He refused to give up. If people first said no, the first issue of Student appeared in January 1968. The two most important British bands of the time were the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. Richard and Johnny enjoyed blasting both hands. While they worked, Richard turned on the charm and convinced Mick Jagger, the lead singer of the Rolling Stones, to be interviewed for Student. And Richard and Johnny both met with guitarist and singer John Lennon of the Beatles. Both Jagger and Lennon was immensely popular. Richard hoped these two major interviews would convince young people to buy Students. Having world-famous rock stars in the magazine made them more established British newspapers, magazines, and radio stations that station takes Students seriously, even if its publishers were still in their teens. Richard also wanted to write about the Vietnam War. Young people around the world thought that U.S. involvement in Vietnam was a mistake. They felt that Vietnam was in the middle of a civil war, and the U.S. had no right to interfere. Richard and the student staff protested against the war in Vietnam. A German television station asked Richard to speak about his opinions on the politics of the war. Soon, people across Great Britain learned more about Richard Branson as newspapers began to write about him and his magazine. Young people were speaking up and hoping to make changes in society and government. Richard and Student were giving a voice to that movement. Late in 1968, Johnny Gems decided to go back to school. Richard struggled to run Student on his own. He asked his old friend Nick Plurl to help. Together, they kept Student going on for 2 more years. At first, no one who worked on the magazine was paid. Student wasn't making any money. Richard and his friends relied on the food and sometimes money that Eve Branson gave them. Over time, Richard's family made a little money and paid the staff. Though he couldn't afford much, Richard was still not making enough money at Student to support himself. But Richard kept the staff happy with the parties he threw at the house. His parents rented for him. Everyone pitched in whatever they could. Richard liked to have fun, and he wanted everyone who worked on the magazine to have fun too. But working at Student meant more than just having fun. Richard made it clear to everyone that the magazine was doing something useful. It was providing young men with information about the world around them. The Richard family found a way to earn his living. He knew how much his staff and all the young people he knew enjoyed rock music. Most music was sold on 17 small and 12 inches wide records of vinyl. People bought them at record shops or large department stores. Richard thought he could make money selling records another way, by mail. Customers would send in an order form and the payment for the records they wanted. He would buy the records and mail them to the customers. Richard promised he could find any record a customer requested. He called his new business Virgin Mail Order. At first, Richard bought records from a London business that charged him low price because he bought such a large quantity. Later, he bought directly from record companies. With both methods, Richard was able to offer low prices than the record stores, and he didn't have to pay rent on a store or hire a lot of employees. His customers got the music they wanted at lower prices than in the stores, and Richard still made a profit. Virgin Mail Order quickly had many new customers, but Richard ran into trouble in 1971 when postal workers in England went on strike. They refused to work until they were paid more money. The strike was bad news for Virgin. How would it send records to its customers? Richard decided it would be a good idea to have his own record store in addition to his mail order business. But he still wanted it to be unlike the other record stores in London. Richard created a store that welcomed teenagers. The staff was young and eager to talk about new music. Customers could listen to music on headphones before they boarded. Richard also made sure the store carried records that customers could easily find anywhere else. Many of these records came from other European countries or the US. His young customers appreciated the effort Richard made for them. They felt that Richard cared about them because he was one of them. Kids, teenagers, and young adults flocked to Virgin Records. Running his record business, however, was not always easy. The expenses of running Virgin mail order grew, and sometimes customers claimed they never received a certain record when they actually had. Richard had to take their word and send another record. That meant he lost money. In 1970, Richard bought a mansion in a village called Shipton-on-Cherwell. The large home had been built in the 17th century and had arches of wood surrounding it. Richard called it the Manor. He wanted to turn it into a recording studio where bands could live while they recorded their music. It was an expensive idea. To buy the manor, Richard had to borrow money from a bank and from his family. His debt soared. To save money, Richard didn't pay the British government taxes on several orders of records. He wanted to use the tax money to pay his debt. Richard knew this wasn't the right thing to do, but he told himself he would start paying the taxes after he paid back the money he owed the bank. Before that could happen, Richard was caught and arrested. He was ashamed, but later he called the arrest one of the best things ever that happened to him. In school, he had always enjoyed breaking or challenging the rules. But now he saw that in business he could not break the law. He came to an agreement with the British government. He would pay all the taxes plus a fine with the help of his family. He paid the government what he owed, and he promised himself he would never break the law again. Then Richard took the first steps towards making the Virgin name famous around the world. Chapter